Welcome to the walkthrough of the frequently made mistakes for assignment 2B. First, please make sure you comment your code. A lot of people are not doing that. You're going to lose points in your final solution. Please also make sure that you don't remove the to-do markers when you add your code. That makes reviewing more complicated. There's a number of problems with simple semaphore. First and foremost, make sure you properly qualify the field that keeps track of the number of available permits. I talked about that in class. I talked about that in the frequently made mistakes walkthrough, so make sure you fix that. Also, don't initialize any of the fields in the declaration part of the class. Put that into the constructor. Don't use atomic integer to define the count of permits. Use the appropriate version that I talked about here with the appropriate qualifier. Make sure that you put the appropriate initialization inside the simple semaphore constructor. There's some important things that are missing here that you need to make sure you add. Make sure you don't put the lock methods inside the try block. Also, make sure to use lock interruptibly. We'll make sure that the unit test that you run for the final assignment 2 submission checks that properly. It should complain if you don't do it correctly, but get in the habit of fixing it now. You don't need to have this gratuitous extra check here. That's handled by the loop. Please get in the habit of using auto increment and auto decrement operations instead of minus equal 1 or plus equal 1. That's just more messy than it needs to be. Your loop condition needs to guard against negative permits, not just things that are going to be greater than 0, but you also need to make sure that you check when it's less than 0 as well. And for goodness sakes, do not call wait on a condition object. That was a mistake I talked about in the lessons when we talked about condition object and the usage consideration. So go back and watch that and see what is going on there. It's horrible. Bad things will happen. You also don't need to have this additional check to see if permits are greater than 0 because you won't get out of that loop until that's the case. Let's take another look at some problems with acquire. First and foremost, the try finally block is in the wrong place here for this method. Also, please don't use synchronized statements. I have no idea what the point of this is, but you're completely missing the point of using your entrant lock. So that's a grave deficiency that you should not be doing. It should not be passing the test, by the way. Don't be catching interrupted exception. That defeats the whole purpose of this interruptible version of acquire. So don't do that. This implementation of acquire uninterruptedly does not meet the specification. There's a lot of people who have problems with that. Long and short of it is you need to make sure that you flag when an interrupt occurs by setting a Boolean and then checking that Boolean at the very, very end of the method before you return. And if you have a problem, if an interrupt occurred, actually it's not a problem. If an interrupt occurs, then you go ahead and reset the interrupted status to indicate that this thread has been interrupted. But this does not do that. It doesn't work properly. This code has a similar problem, this implementation of acquire uninterruptedly. It calls await uninterruptedly, which it should not be doing. That handles it in the wrong way. You need to set a flag, a Boolean flag, and then test that Boolean flag later in the code. And this call here makes no sense either. Here's yet another problem. The try finally block is in the wrong place. Whatever you do not be calling signal in the acquire methods. The signal call goes in the release method. Make sure you put the signal call in the release method, but it doesn't belong in the acquire methods. I have no idea why people are doing that. This code is incorrect. This particular call needs to be moved to the end of the method and checked in the context of a Boolean flag that would be set here instead of making this call at this point. Here are some other problems. I'm not quite sure what this code is trying to do, but bottom line is it's looping and it makes no sense and it doesn't set the flags properly. This approach is too complicated because it uses recursion. It's arguably correct in terms of semantics, but you could end up with a very deep recursion stack. So refactor this to use a loop instead of using the recursive call. And you'll also need to do some other stuff here if you're interrupted. And the checking to see if you were interrupted and the handling of the interrupts needs to be moved after this unlock call. And this code is not doing that. So that's also something that has to be fixed. Make sure you only signal in release if permits is greater than 0, but do make sure you signal in release. Some people were not calling signal. That's another mistake. This if statement is incorrect. You need to always increment the count of permits, not just if it's greater than 0. That makes no sense at all. And this is the wrong call. In the same way that calling wait on a condition variable is a very, very bad thing. Calling notify on a condition variable or condition object is also a bad thing. I think there's basically no way this code could have passed the unit tests. So make sure you're passing the unit tests. And it's unclear why there's a call to unlock that's not in a finally block. You should always be calling unlock in the finally portion to make sure it gets released, even if an exception is thrown. Let's move our attention to the Palantiri manager side of the code. This is the part that's in the reentrant hash map version that's dealing with the Palantiri manager. As you can see here, this code makes no sense because it's trying to initialize an uninitialized map. And of course, there's nothing in the map, so entry set will be null, and so you actually won't initialize anything at all. So rethink this using the list of Palantiri, not the map, which is what you're trying to initialize. And there's something important missing here in the parameter of simple semaphore, so make sure you fix that. Down here, please get in the habit of using a for each method rather than a for each loop. And this call to simple semaphore is also passing in the wrong parameter. Available permits is going to return the value of the available permits call on the simple semaphore, but of course we haven't initialized it yet, so it'll return probably 0 or something bizarre. So, or just give you a null pointer exception or something like that. So this is not going to work either, and that should have been flagged by running the unit tests. Here's some more problems with build model. Make sure you always put a terminal operation at the end of a stream, otherwise it'll never run. This code has a terminal operation at the end of the stream, but it's too complicated. Either use the for each method if you're doing the ugrad version, or use collect correctly with the collector's toMap call if you're doing the graduate version. Down here, this makes no sense. Don't be initializing your simple semaphore in the get semaphore accessor method. Let's now turn our attention to the acquire method in the Palantiri manager class. This also has a lot of mistakes. Make sure that you move these calls outside of the try block. They don't belong there. You don't need to have the equal true when you're checking to see if something is true. If it's returning a Boolean, that's superfluous. You can get rid of it. Don't be calling replace or put here either. Instead, you want to make sure you put the right code in here that'll set the value to be false. Don't be doing this because it's extra work and unnecessary. This is some strange code. I'm not sure why the person's creating a new Palantir, because that's what the purpose of looking in the map is to find this, so don't do that, of course. Don't put the lock interruptibly or lock calls inside of the try block, as we've said over and over again. This code makes no sense. Why are we going through the loop setting each value to false? That's bizarre. You only want to do that if it's available, which we don't know whether it is or not because it's not being tested properly. And I'm not sure what this catch is doing here. It doesn't really belong here either. This is some really complicated code. I don't really know what it's even trying to do. I don't know if it's correct, but it's way more complicated than needs to be the case. So refactor this and simplify it. For the grad student version, you can use a method reference instead of this more complicated Lambda expression. And you'll also need to update the behavior that's in the map call here because this is too simple. You don't want to do just a get key. Instead, you want to do something more sophisticated, and that will allow you to get rid of the put call down here or the replace call. You don't want to be doing put or replace in the acquire method at all. Let's now turn our attention to release. Once again, get these lock calls out of the try block, as we've talked about many times, and don't release the semaphore until after you've unlocked the lock, and make sure to call release outside of the context of the try finally block. That doesn't go there. It could go in the finally block, but it doesn't go in the try block where it goes here. That's the wrong place to put it. And then the last mistake here is the available permits method, which is way too complicated. I'm not sure what this is doing. It may or may not be correct. I don't think it's actually correct. It's not telling you the available permits. It's telling you the total number of permits that could have been available, but not the current count. So this should be a much more dynamic call, and it should be way, way simpler. So go take a look at the simple semaphore call and see what would be the right place to use in that class. So anyway, that's my review. Make sure you run the unit tests, make sure you comment your code, and come to office hours if you have any questions.